Hello and welcome to the second video of part 5 of the Life of the Soviet Citizen documentary. Last time we began to talk about compulsory tasks that the Soviet pioneers were supposed to complete during school hours and after school. One of the more entertaining activities was a sort of gathering activity. We had to collect old paper and old metal that was intended for recycling. Or maybe collecting is a wrong word, since no one cared how the children actually procured the aforementioned old paper and old metal. The important part was to submit a certain amount of paper and metal to the school authorities. Each class had their goal, or rather the minimum amount of paper and metal they had to submit, and children had to achieve that goal in any way they could think of, and they were allowed to be creative. Our supervisors tried to stay away from the process of gathering of these materials, for reasons that will become obvious soon. The environmental propaganda and the manipulative disinformation was going strong not only in the Western countries, but in Soviet Union as well. For example, we were told that 20 kilos of old paper that we give for recycling can save one tree. So we believed that we were really doing something important for the world. Isn't it remarkable how those who own the means of production and thus pollute the most, those who could kill any initiative to use cheaper and more sustainable materials that would hurt their income, accuse simple people of doing the most polluting, and weaponize children to do all the work for them? It's remarkable how this practice was successful in Soviet Union just as much as it is now successful in every so-called capitalist Western country. Also, to be fair, we had a lot less of that specific type of propaganda. So as I said, every Soviet school was supposed to collect a certain minimum amount of paper and metal, and this amount was devised among classes. Since punishments only go so far, in this case, schools tried to motivate children by, for example, declaring competition among classes. Yes, we were very much motivated to collect old paper and metal. Some wanted to help the environment, others wanted to be the good children, some wanted to win. The problems began when we tried to extract old paper from our parents, who were usually reluctant to give away their stash. In Soviet Union, old paper could be exchanged for a pass that allowed the purchase of an interesting book in a bookstore. Yes, there were times when in order to buy a good book by a famous classic author, especially a foreign author, we had to present a pass. So when the parents didn't want to part with their dreams of buying some good literature, the children were presented with an interesting choice: steal the old paper from their home, find old discarded papers and magazines lying around in trash piles, parks, or somewhere in the street corners, or go door to door and ask to donate old paper. So achieving the old paper goal was relatively easy, especially compared to old metal goal. Where do you get old metal as a child? Well, there were places where abandoned rusty cars or even industrial equipment was left lying around. Since everything belonged to everyone, people didn't care to transport such heavy trash, so it was just dumped in the less populated areas. This is where the boys came into the picture. They almost always knew where to find rusty old metal parts. The problem was usually with transportation, and that problem was also for the children to solve. But what if you were unlucky and there was no old rusty metal deposit near your school? Well, this is exactly why I said that nobody cared where the stuff came from. So it was not unheard of that children stole stuff, for example from construction sites, and sometimes children even got hurt during the process. But as communists love to say, there are casualties during the war, and wasn't building communism a real struggle? And of course, participation in such activities was mandatory, and those who tried to get out of it got bad grades for behavior. Yes, that was a separate discipline in Soviet schools, and we were graded for our behavior. And the bad grade was usually accompanied by a strong worded note for parents, written in the student's personal journal. Another extracurricular activity was taking part in pioneer class meeting, that included distributing of very important play pretend titles such as Pioneer Class Leader or the vice pioneer class leader, the pioneer class secretary, etc., etc., planning of pioneer organization activities, and of course, snitching and shaming sessions. I personally remember these meetings being extremely boring, and the only highlight was that one time when we ran away by climbing out of the window when our class teacher/supervisor went out of the class to bring some papers. I don't even remember how we got punished, but I do remember how happy we were to escape. One more thing pioneers had to do was compiling a handmade wall newspaper, or a placard newspaper, a huge poster that included self-written articles, photos, and doodles. 2 or 3 students per class were chosen to complete such a poster, and they had to do it pretty regularly after school. When no student volunteered to be a class journalist, then those who were known for their drawing or writing skills were commanded to take part. Oftentimes the parents were involved as well, or rather ordered by school to take part in making such a poster. There were 2 types of such newspapers. The first type was the propaganda-style posters and the praise and appreciation posters that were meant to be on display permanently on the classroom walls or in the many school corridors. These posters usually included information about the pioneer organization activities, something about socialism and communism, and some other subject that was relevant or made relevant at the moment, such as World War II stories and pictures or Soviet space program. The second type of such posters were the critique posters, which usually contained handmade caricatures and drawings, as well as handwritten articles, verses, and jokes written in a passive-aggressive way that was considered funny and appropriate as soft punishment. These articles were used to shame those who didn't adhere to the rules, and often included lists with names and photos of students who were, for example, late for class. This type of poster newspapers usually had a stingy name like Lightning or Thorn. In fact, these 2 names were so popular that they are still used almost exclusively in schools in Russia. Yes, the good old Soviet-style public shaming of children is still popular in Russia, for example, and just as during Soviet era, it has absolutely no effect. It looks like this sort of critique posters was the favorite among the young journalists, and there are a lot of nostalgic stories posted on the internet where people, mostly women, tell how they enjoyed making such newspapers. At some point, even Soviet children hit puberty, as much as our teachers preferred that we never did. Puberty, reproductive organs, the act of procreation, and anything else sex-related was a taboo subject in Soviet Union, so naturally Soviet education reflected that taboo as well. While today's Western education swung wildly towards irresponsibly exposing children to topics they cannot comprehend or consent to, Soviet Union was on the opposite extreme. You may have heard about that Soviet woman who screamed, "There is no sex in Soviet Union," during a joint American and Soviet talk show that was aired in 1986. While this phrase is often described as a joke, I do not believe it was.
Я хотела бы сказать, что у нас в телерекламе все крутится вокруг секса. Есть ли у вас такая телереклама?
Но секса у нас нет, и мы категорически против этого.
This phrase describes quite accurately the puritanical and even anti-sexual culture of Soviet Union. I think that those twisted morals were one of the reasons why Soviet educators were so fixated on sex shaming of children, which I described in one of my previous videos about Soviet kindergartens. And that was also one of the reasons why women were, and still are, treated so horribly in Soviet maternity hospitals, as if they have committed a disgusting crime of having sex, and now the doctors have to deal with their disgusting reproductive organs. While I absolutely condemn today's style of teaching sex education to children, which looks more like grooming and molestation, I have to say that Soviet morals were just as twisted, only in the opposite manner. It feels almost like communists are not capable to address the topic of sex in a responsible adult way and have to resort to infantile extremes, which comes from childish inability to restrain impulses. One of the examples of Soviet morals was that in Soviet culture it was normal to leave the girls to discover the existence of menstruation when they actually began bleeding, and that was even in the late 80s. Imagine discovering blood in the place you absolutely couldn't mention to anyone and think you are ill or dying. And that was a typical story of many Soviet girls. Obviously, a lot of children speculated about different aspects of sex life, but most of that information was incomplete, wrong, or often used as slurs. And all that information was exchanged in great secrecy, because interest for the other sex or your own body or anything that had to do with reproductive activities was punished even more severely than simple disobedience. Once a girlfriend of mine brought an anatomy book to school, and several girls, including me, took a look at the forbidden chapter. And we all were told to stay after school for interrogation and shaming session, and the book was confiscated. The year was 1988, by the way, and the worst that this book had to offer were pictures of sex organs. You know those creepy dissection illustrations. But that was not allowed. Oh no, no way. Soviet students did study anatomy on their last year of school, and the school book did include 2 chapters about sexual organs, and these 2 chapters were given exclusively as homework, and that information was never on any test. Another problem was the school uniform. While young children might not care about sweating, but it's a whole different story for teenagers. While boys could wear a clean shirt every day if their parents could afford that, the girls were left with 1 or maybe 2 wool dresses in their disposal. Washing those dresses wasn't easy, and it took ages for them to dry, so wearing such a dress every day was a special kind of torture for many girls. Some schools allowed girls to wear shirts and skirts, which made it easier for teens, but was more costly for the parents. While girls who lived in the southern republics suffered because the dresses were too warm, girls in the northern republic suffered because of the freezing weather. Warm tights were difficult to find, so girls had to wear extra layers like pants or some sort of breeches, and then had to take them off in front of other students. Any accessories, makeup, or nail polish were strictly forbidden. While Soviet people in general were obsessed with the stuff that was difficult to obtain, especially anything with embellishments, things that were shiny and colorful, children were not allowed any of that at school. I remember a girl kicked out of the class for wearing a hair clip with a small flower. Another girl was told to take out small earrings. She refused to do it because she just had her ears pierced, and taking out the earrings would heal the holes. So she was told to wear string through the holes. And, as it always happens, despite the shaming, bullying, and strict policies, teenage pregnancies happened in Soviet Union as well. Be it first love or coercion, circumstances didn't affect the fact that the girl always got the full amount of blame. Girls guilty of getting pregnant were called in front of a special school council for interrogation and shaming. Then they were shamed by the Young Pioneer organization, they were bullied by teachers and other students, and their parents often went through similar route: interrogation and shaming at work, often at a special meeting that was called especially for the occasion. And as it always happens, eventually everyone around them found out, and the family was branded problematic. Out-of-wedlock pregnancy was a true drama, and a horrible thing to happen to a Soviet girl. I found an article with a story about Soviet teenage girl getting pregnant, told by her friend and classmate. The girl was 16 at the time, and she got pregnant during summer vacation, and tried to get rid of the child in secret until she got ill herself and was brought to the hospital to give birth. Her girlfriends came for a visit and brought flowers and toys, only to find out her sobbing, saying that she wished the child was dead and how her life was ruined now. A very typical story, but what happened next was a great example of how Soviet people and the Soviet social apparatus treated someone who stepped out of the line. The girls, not the one who got pregnant, but her friends who visited her in the hospital, got called for an emergency meeting at school together with their parents, where they were called various slurs and asked how they dared to visit that slut in the hospital, an act that definitely showed that these girls were in fact sluts themselves. But that was obviously not enough, so the next higher in command got involved, and the girls were ordered to attend a meeting that took place at the district education office, where they were shamed and called names once more, and then ordered to write a letter of apology and explanation why they had ties with such a reprehensible criminal. To add insult to injury, a district gynecologist was called, and the girls were examined right there in the office, and the parents got official documents stating that their daughters were in fact virgins. That last part was not that weird, by the way. At school we were often subjected to various surprise medical treatments. I say surprise because no one announced up front that we were about to be vaccinated, checked for certain illnesses, undergo tests, have our teeth checked and fixed, or at the last years of school checked downstairs as well. All of a sudden, in the middle of a lesson, a school nurse would appear in the doorway, announcing, "We start vaccinations now." The sheer abruptness in which your day went from peaceful studying to fear and pain was enough to freak us all out and sent most of us in a state of shock. Even now, when I remember these moments, my heart starts pounding and my hands get cold. As children, we were absolutely helpless against such tactics. So when we were called by name, we simply did what we were told. One day, when I was about 8 years old, a nurse came into the classroom with a syringe that looked like a gun and told us to roll up the sleeves. I have never seen such a device before, so I freaked out and went into full wild animal mode and refused to take that shot. I got ridiculed and told to take example from other kids who were sitting there with wide eyes and rolled sleeves and quietly obeyed. Those who got the shot and didn't die laughed at me as well. So the next day my dad took me to school, and on the way he persuaded me to take that shot, which I eventually did. The shots, however, were not the worst part. The worst part were the dental checkups. If no problem was found, the kid who felt absolutely euphoric was allowed to return to class. But if there was a problem, the very old device was turned on and the torture session commenced. In Soviet Union, all the dental care was performed without any sedation whatsoever. Not for the elites though. Obviously the Soviet aristocracy always had the best of everything, but we the simple people had whatever was left. As a child, my mother had one of her tooth roots taken out without anesthesia. I cannot even think about the poor girl who almost broke her mother's hand during this torture treatment. I myself had numerous screaming sessions in the dentist chair. But the school dentist device was usually the worst. As a child, you were compelled to lie, cheat, and run away to get out of the school dental treatment. The next worst thing, or maybe the worst, but I was lucky enough to never experience it, was the sexual organs check. This was done mostly in hospital during a general checkup that students had to undergo at the age of 14 or 15. I personally never had such a checkup, which might be due to the fact that I moved back to Kazakhstan at around that age, and the Soviet Union was collapsing at that point, so rules could change. But I heard and read many accounts on how whole classes, or sometimes girls and boys separately, were taken to a hospital, of course without their parents' consent. There was no such thing as parents' consent in Soviet Union, and without the parents' presence, of course. I even suspect that if a parent would demand to be present during such a checkup of their underage child, the request would be declined, and the parent and the child by association would be considered problematic. During such a checkup, girls had to visit a gynecologist for the first time. Imagine being taught nearly extreme modesty and all of a sudden ordered to take your panties off and spread your legs in front of a stranger. That was the great opportunity for the girls to make acquaintance with a punitive gynecology, which I described in more detail in my first video about birth. Many women describe the first visit to gynecologist as a Soviet child as a very traumatic experience. Many were treated with disrespect, received degrading comments, and were manhandled without any consideration of age of them being virgins. Being a virgin was, by the way, paramount, because the findings were sent to school, and if the girl was not a virgin, even at a later age, the parents were notified. Interestingly enough, no one cared about who was actually the partner of these underage girls. The idea was to shame and even punish the girls themselves. Interestingly, not all children went through the whole spectrum of these amazing Soviet medical treatments. Some schools didn't have a dental treatment device. Some didn't care to send the girls for a downstairs checkup. Which raises a question: were those checkups and treatments that necessary if they were not enforced everywhere? The last years of school were dedicated to the preparation for the last graduation exams, and the outcome of those exams defined the teenager's future. Some of the students, those who didn't want to, or whose grades were not good enough to apply for university, could drop out of school after 8 years. 8 years of education was called incomplete secondary school education, and 10 years of school was called complete secondary education. Incomplete secondary education diploma was good for entering a technical school or college that was called technicum or PTU, short of professional technical college, where students could learn specific skills required for certain professions. For example, military and sport-related professions, certain medical professions, certain piloting, railroad or construction-related professions, and so on. Those who completed the whole 10 years of education could apply for one of the university programs, provided the student had good grades and passed several admission tests. A Soviet school diploma was called a maturity certificate, because obviously after finishing school at the age of 17, Soviet teenagers were mature enough to join the communist building forces, I suppose. The last thing that was left to do after the exams were over was the graduation ceremony. In Russian, the ceremony is called the last bell, which basically means that the school bell would ring for the last time for graduates. At some schools, graduates wore a sash with the word graduate and the graduation year written on the front part. Some schools demanded that the students wear a school uniform for the ceremony. Others did not. At the ceremony, diplomas were presented and photos were taken, mostly group photos of the class together with the teachers. After the ceremony, everyone was either back to their classroom for a party with food and soft drinks that the graduates brought from home, or to the school assembly hall, where yesterday's students and now adults could eat and even slow dance. Some students prepared a play or some comedy sketches in advance, which was actually a lot of fun for those involved. Sometimes the party lasted well into the night hours, when children, yes, they were still underage despite me just calling them adults, went outside to tour the city, played guitar, and just have fun with their classmates for the last time before they took the next step on their way to become a peg in the huge faceless socialist machine named USSR. We will talk about Soviet higher education in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this part of the Life of the Soviet Citizen series. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you for watching.